On this episode of Mothman in the Bible Belt, author Eliot Parker dishes on his latest book, Table for Two, a collection of stories, and the Ronan McCullough crime thriller novels. Parker talks about growing up in Charleston, West Virginia, and coming out gay later in life. The author speaks candidly on the West Virginia Legislature trying to remove libraries, museums, and schools from criminal liability exemptions over the display or distribution of materials deemed obscene during this year's legislative session. He also chimes in on whether or not the world should forgive Madonna for her naughty coffee table book, Sex. Coming up next.
Welcome to the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast with your host, Buck Fantastic.
Girl Scout cookies.
Author Eliot Parker was born and raised in Charleston, West Virginia. He's released 7 books to date. In the spring of 2024, Parker was inducted into the West Virginia Literary Hall of Recognition for outstanding contributions to literature and West Virginia. He's a recipient of the Pen, Craft, and Feathered Quill Book Awards, as well as the West Virginia Literary Merit Award. Kirkus Magazine named Parker's A Final Call as one of the great indie books worth discovering in 2022. On top of being a published author, Parker is a writing teacher at the University of Mississippi and hosts the podcast Now Appalachia. He resides in Oxford, Mississippi. Join me, your host, Buck Fantastic, for another exciting episode of Mothman in the Bible Belt. It's eclectic chit-chat of otherworldly origins. Eliot, welcome to the Mothman in the Bible Belt. How are you doing?
I'm great, Buck. Thanks so much for having me. Big fan of your podcast and appreciate the opportunity to come on and be with you.
Thank you. You got a new book out this month called Table for Two, a collection of stories. The stories are set in Appalachia. In your press release, you wrote, the characters in these stories do not always get listened to, and many of them find that the need for attention comes from aggression. A woman confronts her father about his dementia. 2 fathers, whose guilt and shame over the disappearance of their sons hides more sinister motives. A young boy frustrated with a ring appraisal learns a lesson about how people and things can be valued equally. Each of the characters in the collection is faced with a balance of talking and listening with a need for action, which often leads to manipulation and coercion. What motivated you to write an anthology of short stories versus a novel?
Well, that's a really great question. I feel like as a writer, Buck, I learned how to really writing short stories. That was kind of the first genre that I was exposed to as a writer. And when I went and worked on my MFA in creative writing back in 2011, that was really the first kind of genre we were introduced to and really told to kind of examine closely is the short story form. And so I really feel like I cut my teeth as a writer writing short stories. And then I transitioned away from that for a while to go to novels. But short stories have always been really near and dear to my heart. And they've always been something I enjoy reading and something I enjoy writing. And I found that many times if I'm working on a novel project that stepping away from that, if I've got myself written into a corner, if I've written a character into a corner, if I'm having writer's block and I can't just get any movement forward on a manuscript in the novel that I'm working on, sometimes if I just step away from that for a while and work on a short story or outline a short story that I've been thinking about writing, or just kind of dabble with the short story genre a little bit, I find myself kind of reigniting my thinking and reigniting my creative juices, and then that helps me go back to the novel. So I'm a big fan of short stories as a reader, big fan of them as a writer, but I really feel like I mastered or learned how to master. I don't think we ever really master anything as writers, but really how to get your hands around, maybe it's a better way to say this, characters and plot and word choice and dialogue and all of that. Because in a short story, you only have anywhere from 3,000 maybe to 8,000 words to tell a story. And you've got to have all those elements in there, but you've got to keep the story moving and you've got to keep it interesting. And you've got to make these characters leap off the page and really connect with readers. And I feel like if you can do that pretty well with short stories, then that gives you a leg up when it comes time to working on novels, because you're doing those same skills and exercising those same skills as a writer, but you've just got a lot more room to work with.
So, what's your favorite story in this new anthology?
Oh boy, that's a great question. That's sort of like asking someone your favorite child, because they all were they all were excellent. I loved them all. They all were different in some ways because a lot of them presented different challenges. I would say one of my favorites is The River. You read that off the press release. That's the story about the two fathers who go looking for their missing sons, who went on a fishing trip and or a boating trip and didn't come home. And both fathers are going out, and they continue to go out to try to look for their missing sons. And you find out in that story that there's really more going on there. That the disappearance of the two boys was in some ways orchestrated a little bit more than it was just a happenstance accident. So I really like that story because one of the fathers is terribly grieving in the story, and then the other one is sort of grieving, but he's also sort of trying to manipulate the situation. So dealing with those two characters in that environment where you've got one really grieving and one sort of grieving but trying to control the other was really challenging. And oftentimes they had conversation where the one father was trying to manipulate the other father through his grief. And so doing that and kind of orchestrating that as a writer was a great challenge. I loved, there's a story in there called Birthday Boy, and it's about a little boy who decides to throw this big party for, I believe, his 13th birthday, and only one of his classmates comes out of all of the people that he invited. And it's one of his classmates that he wasn't very close to and didn't really know all of that well. And he was disappointed in that, but he finds through that experience, and he finds through what ultimately happens to him after the party is sort of over officially, that he really understands what friendship and love really is about. And it doesn't necessarily come from having a big party. So I feel like we've all been through that as an adolescent, as a teenager, sort of that trying to fit in and identify and develop relationships. And so he goes through that whole experience at his birthday party. You mentioned the first story in the collection, which I really liked also, from the Stars Above, about a father who goes wandering in a park late at night. And there's a woman named Tabitha who finds this father walking walking sort of the park sort of aimlessly. He looks lost. His name is Lance. And so he tells Tabitha, my name is Lance, but that's really all he can tell her. And so then the daughter has to find out, where is her father? Where is Lance? Why is he out wandering? Where has he been? And it's really an interesting story about the dynamics that exist between parents and children, older parents and children. But also it is an interesting story in how we as individuals deal with someone who is losing their ability to be themselves. Because Lance is very much himself physically, but he's not the same person that he was mentally. And Lisa, his daughter, is having to cope with that. And for a while, she's just been sort of putting that out of her mind. She's just been pretending like nothing is wrong, that nothing's wrong with Lance, that her father is fine. But it's this incident in the park when Tabitha comes upon him sort of wandering aimlessly that she really has to reassess her relationship with her father and how she deals with him and kind of what's the next steps going to be. So a lot of them in there are my favorites, but I would say those are three that really, really stood out to me. And when I think about the collection as a whole, and I think about the ones that were the most challenging to write in a lot of ways, but also the ones I think about the most, having finished the manuscript a year and a half ago, those three still kind of percolate in the back of my mind.
Several of your books are set in West Virginia. How do you tackle writing about a state like West Virginia and avoid creating horrible cliches and stereotypes?
Yeah, that is something that, and that's really honestly one of the reasons why I write about West Virginia the way that I do, is because I don't want those stereotypes to permeate. And I will say, in fairness to stereotypes, the reason stereotypes exist is because there is a kernel of truth to them. Oftentimes that small kernel of truth gets exaggerated and blown out of proportion, but it wouldn't exist if there wasn't some kernel of truth to it. So we do have our stereotypes, West Virginia does, as a region, as a culture, and as a people, that is warranted in some degree. But I think, what most of the country sees when they see West Virginia is when there is a disaster of some sort, when there is a coal mining disaster, when there is a natural disaster, a flood, or some kind of natural phenomenon that occurs, or there's a plane crash, or there's something really devastating that occurs in the state. That's when the national media kind of swoops in And oftentimes what they depict of West Virginia is not flattering. They look for those stereotypes and they try to enhance those stereotypes. And if you're living in Oklahoma, Texas, Oregon, Washington State, and you have no idea, have never been to West Virginia, you think that's kind of what we are and that's who we are. And we're so much more than that. We're so much more than that as a people. We're so much more than that as a culture. And so when I'm writing about West Virginia, I want some of our, I don't try not to sugarcoat some of the problems that we have, some of the economic challenges our people have, some of the socioeconomic disparities that exist. Certainly the opioid situation and the drug problems that the state has faced really over the last 25 or 30 years. I try not to sugarcoat those because those things are happening and have happened and are still going on. But I want people to see that there's so much more, and that the people are really what make West Virginia special. Yeah, yes, it's got a lot of natural beauty. Yes, it's got a lot of things going for it from a topography standpoint that everybody loves, values, and respects. But the people are really what make the state what it is. And I want those people to be portrayed in a positive light and in a realistic light. And so that's why I try to write West Virginia the way that I do.
You are working on another thriller, Double Cross. Is this another book in the Ronan McCullough crime thriller novels or a Stacey Tavitt book?
It is the third book in the Ronan McCullough novels. So the first book was Fragile Brilliance. The second book was called A Knife's Edge. And then this one is called Double Crossed, which picks up about 6 to 9 months after everything finishes up in A Knife's Edge. And so A Knife's Edge picks up about 6 months after everything in Fragile Brilliance ends. And so, yeah, it is a part of that story. It is the third book in that trilogy so far. So I have about 6 books planned in that series for Ronan. He's not going to go on forever. He's not going to be like Kay Scarpetta, the character that Catherine Coulter's Kay Scarpetta character, or he's not going to be like Joe Pickett from C.J. Box's novels or Walt Longmire from Craig Johnson's novels. He is going to have an ending to his story. So I've got about 6 books, in the pipeline. 6 total in his story. So we're about halfway through the story I want to tell about him. But yeah, it is the third book in that series.
So what's the plot for Double Crossed?
The plot for Double Crossed is essentially involves, and kind of the thread that runs through this is, how do you find a killer, or how do you find a suspected killer when that killer doesn't really exist? And so the book begins with the murder and the burning of a body of a federal agent that is found on the west side of Charleston. And some of this ends A Knife's Edge, as I was talking about a moment ago, the second book in the series. And so at the end of that book, not to give too much away, but Ronan discovers the body, or he's called to a scene where there's a burning body. We don't really know who the body is. We don't really know kind of what's going on. But Ronan kind of looks down on the body and says, oh, crap. Well, we pick that up at the first couple of pages of Double Crossed, and he realizes that with that oh, crap moment is when he kneels down and he finds the ID that is still hasn't been burned totally. And this person that's laying there on the ground is a Department of Homeland Security agent. And so he's got to figure out, why is someone put this body here, not only murdered this person, but set this person on fire. At the same time, there is an explosion down at Haddad Riverfront Park in Charleston. With folks that are familiar from Charleston will know where that is. So there's a simultaneous explosion that goes off at that particular time as Ronan's trying to investigate this. And so he's got to wonder, is this terrorism? Is these two situations related? Are they not related? But ultimately what Ronan is dealing with is a crime and a killer who can't be seen. And it has and I don't want to give too much away, but it involves cryptocurrency. It involves the movement of money through crypto. It involves people operating on the dark web, people operating sort of in the shadows, orchestrating a lot of things. And what makes this challenging for him is, you can't go out and grab these people like you would a normal suspect. Or you can't go, storm their house, or you can't go, surround them at work, or, send a SWAT team in after them. These people exist sort of on a screen, and they exist, with a name, and they exist with credentials that you can't reach out and touch. And so that sort of aspect of the plot is heavily involved into the death of that federal agent that I was talking about and the explosion that happens at Haddad Riverfront Park. And that's the frustrating thing for Ronan, is he starts to put the clues together, but he can't reach out and grab who he knows or who he thinks he knows has done this, because this person in some ways doesn't seem, or these people don't seem to exist. And then, one of the storylines in Ronan's story, Buck, is that he's a gay cop in Charleston. So he has a relationship with his partner, Ty Andino, who is an emergency room nurse at the hospital there. And so as a result of all of these terrible things happening, Ty gets pulled into the investigation, obviously, because he's the charge nurse and the triage nurse that greets the victims and when they come into the hospital, brought in on the ambulance. And so despite Ronan's best efforts to keep Ty out of what's going on, he has to find out what's going on based on his role. And then he and Ronan have a lot of conversations. And then Ty gets a little too involved in the story in what Ronan is trying to do, and that puts him in danger. And then Ronan has this plucky nephew who came to stay with him in the first book, Fragile Brilliance, that he's kind of adopted as his own. And he's a typical, 18, 19-year-old teenager doing 18 and 19-year-old things. And so Ronan's got his hands full, needless to say, and double-crossed. But the main plot is that strong thread of how do you catch a killer or a group of people when you can't identify them, when you can't find them, when you can't wrap your hands around them and really touch them. How do you solve a crime or several crimes when that's the case?
Did that man need to be found all burnt and shit on the west side? Couldn't he have been found in North Charleston or Canal City?
Yes. I'm so glad you asked that, because someone's going to email me and say, are you picking on the west side? Why are you picking on the west side?
We got so much shit going on here on the west. I live on the west side.
I know you do.
I'm not
from
saying,
the west side.
I'm not saying there's not bad things happening, but we just get such a bad rap here,
Yeah, there's a reason why I put the body. There is an actual tactical reason why I put the body where I did on the west side. I won't give away what that is, but yeah, I am going to get some emails from readers that are be like, "Why are you always picking on the west side?" And I'm from the west side. I went to school on the west side. My parents grew up on the west side, so I know all about.
Were you in a gang?
No, I was not in a gang. No,
okay.
No, I was not. A video game gang. I don't know when I was a teenager. I don't know if that counts, but no.
So when's Double Cross coming out?
It will be out in late August or early September. I think right now, if everything goes, and the date has been pushed back a couple of times because this is what happens in publishing, but if everything holds true, which it looks like it's going to right now, it should be out either the last Tuesday in August or the first Tuesday in September, the Tuesday after Labor Day. So we're looking at a late August or early September release.
When did you come out as gay?
Not until I was in my 20s, late 20s, early 30s. I'd known for a while, but I was busy with life, and I was busy with college and graduate school and trying to find out if what I'd went to college for is what I really wanted to do. And, just that odd time that you have in your 20s. I hated my 20s in a lot of ways. It was just this weird kind of like the first part of my 20s was great, but then like the mid 20s and late 20s was just this odd, just such an odd time in my life. And then my dad got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2008 and died not long after his diagnosis, which is towards the tail end of my 20s. And so the decade of the 20s was just this kind of weird thing. And so I kind of knew, but I just didn't have time to really process it or deal with it because I had so many other life events going on. But yeah, around that time.
Is there any plans for any homoerotic thrillers in the future for you?
Well, if there is some homoerotic moments between Ronan and Ty in the three books, and so there are moments of that. In terms of a straight homoerotic thriller, I am working on one now that is centered around a gay relationship that goes south very quickly and leads to someone in the couple's orbit being killed. And you sort of find out that the reason this person was killed was because of the secrets that he had with the couple in the relationship that one partner didn't know. The other, so character B and C had a relationship. Well, C and B had secrets that partner A didn't know about, and partner A and C, or character A and C had, a friendship, but they had secrets that partner B didn't know about. And so, as things come to the surface, you realize that. Both character A and B that are in the relationship had been keeping things from each other, some pretty big things, but also that character C was kind of playing both of them in different ways. And it's really twisty, really, really good. I'm really pleased with it. I'm about 7,000 words into it, so we're kind of over the hump on the backside of the story. But if I can pull it all together and get all the red herrings tied up, I think it'll be a great story. But it's loosely based on a true story about a couple that this happened to back in 2004, I believe it was, down in Miami, down in South Beach, Miami, that area. And it was covered in the Miami Herald and in local news down there for a long time. But it was a fascinating story about just deception and betrayal, and how this couple didn't really know each other, even though they'd been together for a long time. You had this third person that each of them was friends with, who was intentionally and unintentionally playing the other two against each other, and it was just this really twisted sort of sets of circumstances. And so it's loosely based on that. I've changed a lot and added some things to it, but I think it'll be really, really, really good when I get it. Well, at least I get the first draft done. So we're getting there with that.
Do you go nanners writing sequels to your books? I mean, just trying to figure out a new original plot.
It's difficult in that regard. Yeah, it is. It's difficult in that regard because you want to make sure that your plot is different, and that's the great challenge in writing thrillers, mysteries and thrillers, is that so many plots have been done in so many different ways. Coming up with something that's totally unique and original is always a challenge. And so that's one of the reasons I kind of worked cryptocurrency and the cryptocurrency market into this book, because it's something that I didn't know much about. It's something that in Double Cross that I didn't know much about, and I wanted to learn a lot about. And I thought, wow, what a great way to do something that hasn't been done a lot before. There's some other books, David Baldacci and Harlan Coben and some other mystery thriller writers have kind of dabbled in cryptocurrency being sort of a subplot of a lot of their thrillers. But I think this is one of the few books where it's like at the forefront of what's happening, at least to my knowledge. And so that's a challenge. You want to come up with something that's new and original, but also you want your characters, Buck, those characters that readers have followed through one book or two books or three books, you want them to have the same qualities and characteristics that readers really like about them, but you also want them to grow and change in some degree by the end of the book. So you don't want Ronan to be the same character at the end of Double Cross that he was at the beginning, and you don't want Ty to be the same character at the end of Double Cross that he was at, let's say, the beginning of A Knife's Edge. So you've got that challenge too. You've got to hold true to some of the things that those characters do and say, and some of their values that make readers love them, but they've also got to grow and change and evolve. So, writing a sequel isn't as easy as it sounds or as easy as you think. I mean, you get the benefit of kind of having the same setting that you've already established and having those characters established, but you've also got to go back and kind of plug in some holes for the reader. If somebody picks up Double Cross and hasn't read Fragile Brilliance and A Knife's Edge, you've got to have moments in the book where you kind of explain, okay, here's how we got here. We got here because in 6 months ago this happened, or we got here because a year ago this happened in Fragile Brilliance, so that they get a sense of how we got here. But and hopefully they'll go back and read those books, but you don't want to have to do this major info dump for people that have read the first two books to slow them down in the story. So it's got a lot of advantages, but a lot of challenges, I think, too, as a writer.
You've written two cop thrillers, Fragile Brilliance and Knife's Edge, about a Charleston, West Virginia police sergeant, Ronan McCullough. Did you base Ronan off of any particular Charleston police officer or officers?
I did not. I did not. I have some friends who have worked for the Charleston Police Department, and some of them still work for the Charleston Police Department. So they were invaluable in kind of giving me some sort of inside baseball, behind the scenes information about how things work, sort of like the day-to-day, what they do when they're not on patrol, what they do when they've gone to the scene, when they have to go back and file their reports, when they have to do shift changes. If you're working the night shift, and you have to meet with the sergeant at the end of the shift, and then the day shift is coming in to kind of get their debriefing for the day. So some of those kinds of things I learned a lot from them. No, I did not want to base it on anyone in particular, because I didn't want someone to pick up the book and say, oh, that character is just like my uncle so-and-so, or my husband, or my dad, or anything like that. But I would say Ronan is an amalgamation of a lot of different people in law enforcement that I've talked to, not just Charleston police officers, but sheriffs. I've had a chance to talk to some folks with the Ohio Highway Patrol. I've had a chance to talk with some folks here in Mississippi, where I live now, the Mississippi Highway Patrol. So Ronan is kind of a compilation of all of those people. He's sort of everybody kind of rolled into one. And he's got a lot of the traits and characteristics that I picked up from interviewing those folks, but just hearing those folks talk about their job and their work and what it's like to do that kind of work day to day.
You grew up in Charleston. What high school did you go to?
Capital.
So when you graduated,
1998.
were there any like teachers at Capital that encouraged your love in literature and writing?
Oh, absolutely. I was very fortunate to have excellent teachers at Capital. Of course, you know, when I was going to school, it was very different. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have social media. We didn't have 24-hour cable news, or other than CNN. And I think maybe Fox News had come out not long before I graduated, but there was no MSNBC. There was no Newsmax, Breitbart, all these things now that just sort of inundate us with information all the time. So it was a different period, but no, I had excellent teachers at Capital, and I would say two teachers that really had a significant impact on me as a reader and a writer. One was my 11th grade English teacher, Nancy Reeves, Mrs. Reeves, who unfortunately passed away several years ago. But you know, Mrs. Reeves, her attitude was, find a book on a subject that you like and read it, and it doesn't matter if it's, you know, a book off of an approved list, or it doesn't matter if it's a book I think you should read or shouldn't read or whatever. Find something that you like to read and read it. And we read, in her class was American Lit. And so we read The Crucible by Arthur Miller. We read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which is one of my favorite books ever. We also read The Great Gatsby in her class, which is one of my favorite books ever. But she just had a wonderful way of helping us make connections with the literature and connect it to ourselves, and to not be afraid for having a perspective or a take on a character or something we were reading that maybe seemed off the wall. You know, she was so good at respecting everybody's opinions and everybody valuing everything that everyone said. And she just did it in a very kind way. And I also discovered my love of John Steinbeck in her class, because throughout the year, every 9 weeks, we had an independent book project, and she would give us a list. And I think 2 out of the 4 9-week periods, we had to pick a book off the list. And then the other 2, we could just pick something that we wanted to pick. But, and we couldn't pick the same book. And so I don't know, I missed the day that the sign-in sheet went around. And so there was literally 3 books left by the time it was time for me to sign up. And so I signed up for The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, because I'd heard of that book. And I remember there was a black and white movie made about it that I'd seen on Turner Classic Movies or something one time. So I think, well, I'm kind of familiar with that, about the Dust Bowl. And I fell in love with the book. I fell in love with Steinbeck's writing. And then from that point forward, I went and read everything that Steinbeck wrote. I agree. I do think, though, that East of Eden is his best book. I know The Grapes of Wrath he won the Pulitzer for, but the East of Eden, rather, is his greatest book, which is his retelling of the Cain and Abel story from the Bible, which is just a masterpiece of storytelling and literature, if you haven't read it. But so she was one. And then in 12th grade, I took AP English, and Gene Petrie was my AP English teacher. And he was very much like Mrs. Reeves. He found value in everything that we said, but he just had so much energy and enthusiasm and passion for reading. And we read all kinds of stuff in his class. We read international literature. We read classics. We read contemporary. We read horror novels. We read graphic novels. We read everything that you could imagine. And it was just so interesting to read all of that different stuff. And he was just so passionate and enthusiastic that even if you were reading a book that you didn't really like, you couldn't help but kind of ultimately enjoy the book by the end, because he had such passion and enthusiasm for it. And I'm just so grateful for him. And then the third teacher that I had didn't teach English. Her name was Nancy Humphreys, and she taught Latin. And I took her for 3 years of Latin. And I'm the writer I am today because of her class and because of her, because when you take Latin, you don't speak it like Spanish and French or German or Italian or any of those other languages, but you learn how words work. You learn the structure of words, how root words work, how prefixes and suffixes work, and how words in a sentence relate and interact with each other. And it was from her class that I feel like I really learned how words work in a sentence and how words really work together and don't work together to create meaning. So those 3 teachers right there really made my high school experience. And I was successful in college, I think because of them. Well, I know because of them. And I've been successful as a writer and a professor in life from having, and in life outside of that, from having those three as teachers.
How has your taste in literature changed over the years?
That's really an interesting question. I think it's changed in that I used to be a fiction only reader, and I used to just read all the fiction that I could get my hands on because that was my favorite. And I thought, well, it's not fiction, then it's just not going to be any good. But as I've gotten older, as I went to college, as I took a lot of different classes in a lot of different areas outside of just your basic reading, writing, math, and science, I really developed a love for history and nonfiction writing. I just finished Eric Larson's book, The Demon of Unrest, which is just a wonderful, wonderful story about the first 6 months of Abraham Lincoln's presidency prior to Fort Sumter being attacked and the start of the Civil War. And it kind of opens where Lincoln walks into the White House, and you get a sense that he didn't really think he was going to win the election. And now he's won the election. And he's sort of standing there thinking, oh, crap, now what do I do? I've got a country on the brink of civil war. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is breaking down. The economy's not in good shape. We've just got all these issues. The Buchanan administration was a disaster. They did nothing. And some of his urchins are trying to hang on and get another term in Lincoln's presidency. You got all this going on. But I mentioned that because he writes history, Buck, like it's fiction. And you're reading this story and you have to pause and remember, oh yeah, this really did happen. These people he's writing about are real. And one of the things I learned from reading history and reading a lot of nonfiction is that really good nonfiction writers and really good historians that are telling history and retelling history write it in such a way that you think you're reading fiction. And you have to kind of take a double take or pull yourself away from the text and once in a while and be like, oh yeah, this really did happen. This is a real thing. This isn't just something that he created or she created. So I would say that's one way that my reading taste has changed. And I'm kind of a cyclical reader. So I'll read fiction for a while. I'll read nonfiction for a while. Then I'll read some biographies for a while. Then sometimes I'll dabble in some historical fiction, a little bit of romance here and there, and then go back to fiction. So I kind of read in cycles. I read a lot until I get tired of that genre. Then I bounce off to something else. A lot more history, a lot more nonfiction, and the value that it has, but just not being afraid to step out and be a cyclical reader and read all kinds of things in other genres, even if it's a genre that's not my favorite or one I'm not real comfortable with.
Does placing beefcakes like Fabio on book covers still sell books like it used to in the 90s?
I think with AI and with Photoshop and with all these advanced tools, I'm not so sure it does anymore. I think that, anybody that has a computer and some kind of desktop navigating skills can create a cover that looks like that. Whereas, back in the 90s and even in the 80s, when those books were being put together and those covers were being constructed, there were actually physical photos taken. You would have a photo shoot. You'd line this person up in all these poses and wearing all these costumes, and you'd have somebody actually, snapping the camera, and then they would take those and lay them out and, do different things with them that way. But now you can do all of that a lot cheaper, a lot less time and labor intensive, and do it within 5 or 10 minutes, and it looks just as good as what you did, back in the 80s and 90s respectively. So I don't know. I mean, I hear publishers talk about this a lot, writers talk about this a lot. You want your cover to be something that if somebody's on somebody sees it facing outward on the shelf, they're gonna run over and at least look at it. I think that's true to some degree, but I don't know that the beefcake or the half-naked Scarlet on the front of covers, has the gravitas that it does anymore, because I think we see it so much now because of internet and online and everything, and they're so easy to make. Anybody can replicate one really if they want to. So I think it's probably still relevant, but I think it's lost a little bit of its pizzazz.
In your opinion, was Pamela Anderson brave for completely writing her own memoir, Love Pamela, all on her own? Many in the entertainment industry, they use ghostwriters.
Right. Oh, I have utmost respect. I have utmost respect for anybody who writes a book, whether it's a memoir, whether it's a book of poetry, a collection of short stories, a romance novel, a graphic novel, whatever it is. I have tremendous respect, because no one really knows the time and the effort and the solitary confinement you put yourself in as an individual to get that book put together. Unless you know someone who's done it or you've done it yourself, you just have no idea. I mean, we as consumers see the final product, we see the cover, and we see the book on the shelf wherever it may be, but there are so many labor intensive hours that go on, hours and hours, and days and weeks and months that go on behind the scenes that nobody sees. So hats off to her for doing that, because the easy thing to do is to hire a ghostwriter, write him a check, and say, yeah, have a manuscript ready for me to look at in a year or a year and a half, and I'll add a few things, take a few things out, and then send it on. But for her to take the time to sit down and actually write it herself, hats off to her. And I think, her writing it herself, you get totally her perspective. I mean, you're getting everything as she remembered it, as she saw it, as she felt it, for good or bad. You're getting that true experience from her perspective and only her perspective. Hats off to her for doing that. I mean, that is not an easy task. And if you're not naturally a writer, or you haven't done a lot of writing, or you are not really inclined to write, which I can't say that she is or isn't, but just sort of from, the 30,000 view perspective, she doesn't strike me as that kind of person. But if she's not, then even more hats off to her, even, 2 gold stars for her, because that makes it even longer and more intensive and more time consuming to get that right. So good for Pamela. 2 thumbs up for her.
Will the world ever forgive Madonna for her raunchy coffee table book sex?
Yes, because there's going to come a period when we will look at Madonna like we look at the Beatles or Patsy Cline or some other famous singer from a different period as time goes on. I think we will look back at that as sort of an asterisk on her resume, but I don't think it's going to be sort of a big deal, because if you think about when that happened and you think about where we are now, Buck, and you think about, you hear that expression, sex sells. Well, I mean, it's everywhere now. I mean, she was doing something very risque before.
That book really sold.
Yes, and she was doing it before that was popular. And now everybody's kind of doing this quasi risque kind of stuff. And I mean, we've had we've had all these we had Beyonce, and we've had all these different kind of singers doing these very risque dances and poses and all of these things in their videos and all of that. So, and we just look at that and kind of be like, oh, isn't she beautiful? And then we go on. So I think we're going to look at that the same way as we look at Madonna. We're just going to we'll look at it and be like, well, she did it then, but I think it'll just be an asterisk. I don't think it will. I think we will forgive her, and I think we will not ignore the fact that it happened, but I don't think we will hold it against her either.
Yeah, she kind of bounced back in the literary world. Nearly 20 years ago, she started writing all those children's books, and I was shocked. She went from sex, children's books. Wow.
As she gets older, she has matured, I guess.
When writing a book, what are the most important ingredients in crafting a best-selling novel that readers just can't put down?
I think it all starts with characters. I think you have to have a character, albeit the protagonist or someone in the story that the reader can identify with and kind of cling on to as you're taking them through the story. I think if you don't have characters, you don't have a story. And so when I'm teaching workshops, or I get that question asked to me a lot by writers, I say, a lot of writers will say, well, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the plot, and I've spent a lot of time using that plot structure, that sort of upside down triangle, or that sloped triangle that oftentimes we know of and have heard of and have been referred to as writers to help set up our story. And those are very important. You don't want to overlook that, or overlook that drawing or those plot points or any of that. But I always encourage folks to spend some time with your characters, because excuse me, the plot's going to be important. That's going to be kind of what happens to these people as the story goes along. But your characters are going to be how they see what happens as the story goes along, and how they experience what happens as the story goes along. It comes from characters. And so I think you've got to have really, really good characters, really strong. You've got to have a great protagonist, and you've got to have an antagonist or antagonists that are as capable as the protagonist. Because you want that antagonist to be able to keep the protagonist from getting whatever it is he or she wants. And they've got to be formidable. They've got to be smart. They've got to be savvy. They've got to be ruthless in some cases, depending on what kind of story that you're writing. They've got to be conniving, and they've got to be a liar, and they've got to be all these different things that you may need them to be. So spend a lot of time with characters. And I also think it's really important, Buck, for you to spend a little bit of time thinking about the first 5 or 6 pages. Where are you going to start your story? Where are you going to introduce some of these characters? Where are you going to introduce the world that you've established? Where are you going to introduce the conflict, one of the conflicts that's coming up? And obviously different genres, do different things. For example, I love in thriller stories, and one of the techniques I like to use is I like to drop the readers in the middle of kind of a chaotic situation and let them kind of figure out, oh, how did we get here and what's going on? Sort of like Ronan stumbling upon the burned body of a dead Homeland Security agent at the beginning of Double Cross. And now you got to figure out, what is a Homeland Security agent doing dead? What is he doing where he is? And like you mentioned, what's he doing being burned alive, at this particular moment? Why was he burned alive and all of this? If you're doing a romance story or a romance novel, maybe you want to spend the first 5 or 6 pages when the breakup occurs. When the husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend or whatever it is have their penultimate fight, that's when she says, "You're out of here. I don't want to be married anymore. We're through." Or maybe she uncovers the envelope indicating there was an affair, whatever it may be. You could start your story there. If you're writing science fiction, it's a little different. If you're writing, history or memoir, it's a little different. So I would say spend a little bit of time thinking about where do you want to start the story and how do you want your first 5 pages to go? Because that's going to be not only the reader's introduction to your writing style, but that's going to be the reader's introduction into these characters and into some of the conflict that's going to be enveloping these characters. And you want to make sure that you kind of introduce who these people are, but get that reader really engaged in what's happening and connected to these people as early as possible, because you want them to get past page 5 and get into chapter 2 and 3 and 4 and keep following these people as the story unfolds.
I've been watching comedian Red Squirrel read all kinds of naughty, fake children's books like Linda's Tight Clam Needs Loosening, Cucumber Curtis Can't Come to Dinner, Mike Cunt Smells Like Fish, and Chewy's Big Balls. These types of books have been growing in popularity since Adam Mansbuck put out Go the Fuck to Sleep in 2011. Why do you think these adult parody books appeal to such a broad audience?
Well, I think it touches on some of those things that adults deal with on a day-to-day basis and that adults find funny. And it exposes it sort of in a way of childlike innocence that we remember. For example, I was at the bookstore over Memorial Day weekend and I saw a couple of books. I wish I'd taken pictures of them. I didn't, but one was about it was something about My Butt is Flat. And it was this children's book about this little boy who is upset because his butt is flat. And it's got like a picture of him with kind of his pants halfway down. And this was a children's book about his flat butt. And then I saw another book in a different store on the shelf that was about farting. And it was about, something about this little kid who was farting and upset because he was farting. And I'm thinking, wow, this wasn't around when we were growing up. We were reading Grimm's Fairy Tales and the Berenstain Bears and Cat in the Hat and all of Roald Dahl's books, James and the Giant Peach and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and all of that. We weren't reading about flat butts and farts and all these other things. But I guess it's because, again, that as adults, we start thinking about that. We start thinking about, why is this droopy now? Or why is this firm part of my body suddenly withering away or getting flabby? Or, oh my gosh, why is it every time I eat something I get gas? All these things we deal with as adults, particularly as we get older. And seeing it kind of from that childlike perspective, I think takes us back, to when we were read to as children or when we read some as children, but does it in sort of a non-threatening way. So I think that's part of where that comes from.
I think these books are hilarious, but I know some prudes, they get all huffy puffy over them, and I don't get it. I mean, I think they're funny, but this year in the West Virginia Legislature, House Bill 4654 was all the rage. The bill, if passed, would have removed criminal liability exemptions from libraries, museums, and schools over the display or distribution of materials deemed obscene. It died, thankfully. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've got several thoughts on that. Having a lot of friends who work in the library system in West Virginia, both in the public library system and the academic library system, and having been a library brat myself and encouraging certainly libraries to be the sustainable drivers of education and literacy in our communities that they are. I feel like, my initial response to that is, well, who's to say what's obscene?
Exactly.
Your version of obscene and my version of obscene are two different things. Now, and we have an example of this not too long ago in the not too distant past with Harry Potter. And I can remember, when I lived in West Virginia at the time, I can remember hearing people say, well, I would never, let my child read that book because it's about witchcraft and it's about sorcery and it's about casting spells on people and all of that. Well, yeah, there is some elements there. And if you don't want your child to read that, that's fine. But don't stand on the soapbox or go through a courtroom or a legislative process and say, because I find that offensive, your kid can't read that. And, we saw that play out nationwide. And every time a Harry Potter book came out, this comes back to the media and portraying certain sections of people differently. We always had these people that were protesting and just all up in arms. Oh, this is about sorcery and the devil and witchcraft and all of that. And that is fine. As the parent of a child, you have that right to determine and say, we're not going to read this right now. Maybe when you're a little older, you can read it. That's fine. But don't use that as the bully pulpit and the platform to censor everybody. And I think so that's part of my answer on that. Second part of my answer is, we need to get kids reading. And we need to get kids interested in reading. And it's too late when they're 14. I mean, I work with young adults. I work with college students. I work with community college students for a while, work with high school students for a while. At that age, it's too late to get kids interested in reading. You got to get them interested when they're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And if it's something like Harry Potter, I mean, don't you remember, Buck, how wonderful it was to see kids of that age camped out front of a bookstore 2 hours before the bookstore opened at midnight because they wanted to be the first kids to get the new Harry Potter book? I mean, we had never seen anything like that in our lifetimes. And we want kids to have that enthusiasm and excitement about reading. And so I think we have to have a balancing act. And I think, parents certainly, as the arbiters of their child's life and their learning, need to have a say. I completely agree. And if you don't want your child reading something, that's fine. But this sort of putting people in, giving these people platforms and putting people in buckets and saying, well, because I find this offensive, we're not going to let your kid or anybody at the school or anybody in the school system read this particular book because I don't think this is. Well, who's to say your level of offensive is my level of offensive? And so I think we go down a very slippery slope when we try to legislate things. And my thoughts on this are, and I've seen this a lot with educational legislation, governments at all levels, local, state, and federal, don't do big very well, and they don't do comprehensive very well. And so what I mean by that is when they're passing these large bills that are supposed to blanket everything and cover everybody, it ends up being a disaster usually because there's so many loopholes and it doesn't really resolve all the questions that, kind of perpetuated the problem to start with. But, it's a situation where I think that we really have got to be very careful because we need to get kids interested in reading. And my view is that, and I have to say, I don't have children. Okay. So I don't, I'm speaking from a different platform here, but as someone who's worked with children who have been read to and have been readers, as opposed to kids who haven't been readers and haven't been read to on the back end of things, I can tell you that we need children reading more and we need them reading earlier than they are now. And if that means they have to read something that has a little bit of violence in it. Now, we don't want them reading, things about people getting butchered. But, if we want them reading Harry Potter, if we want them reading the original Grimm's fairy tales, if we want them reading certain things, then I think that's okay. If they're excited and interested in reading, let them read it. And you as the parent can step in and have those conversations with your child. But what you can't do is be totally offended and totally against something that is on the shelf at the school library or the public library, and then stand up and say, well, because I find it offensive, no one's going to read it. You just can't do that. And as a legislative body, you can't stand up there and say, we're going to pick this book as a winner, this book as a loser, this book as a winner, this book as a loser. Government's also very bad at picking winners and losers, in addition to doing things comprehensively. So it's a multifaceted, I know it's a long answer to that question. It's a multifaceted problem, but I think it really all comes back to that initial thing that I said, or initial answer I had was, well, who's to say what you think's offensive is what I think's offensive? And so if we get back to that, and we get back to having conversations about that and not, finger pointing at each other and throwing, verbal stones at each other over what my kids should read and what should be on the bookshelf and what shouldn't be, I think we'll be able to have a much better situation.
When I was 8, I picked up this book at the Marmette branch of the Kanawha County Public Library called Boys and Sex. I probably shouldn't have, but looking back, I learned a lot. It was an educational book. It wasn't anything graphic or anything. It was all about sex eds for little boys, which was aimed probably towards teens, but my little hands didn't know the difference. So when my mom found out I had the book, she kind of lost her shit and took it from me. I get that, but I mean, for some kids who have parents who don't want to have talks about human sexuality and how not to become a parent, it's essential that these kids who want to be educated on how not to be a teenage parent have their hands on these books if they want to actually know the ins and outs of the birds and the bees, especially if they go to a school where they're not learning these things. That's my big concern about these anti-obscenity laws. Sex ed to many holy rollers is obscene.
It is. And we forget that at that age especially, that books serve two purposes. They're there to entertain, but they're also there to educate. And if we take some of these books away that are educating our children about certain things, even if they're uncomfortable things like sex and pregnancy and all of these kinds of things, then we're cutting off a conduit of learning to them that I don't think is right either. And, we get into this, and then you get into this slippery slope of, okay, well, we start taking books out. Well, then what's the next thing? Are we going to take magazines out that have the same issue, that cover the same topics? Are we going to stop allowing certain content to be on YouTube or some other platform that's related to that education? Are we going to take away those PBS documentaries that you and I probably watched in the 80s and 90s about all of this? Are we going to suddenly exclude those because those are talking about and educating our kids about uncomfortable things that maybe we don't want to really talk about all that much? I mean, you just go down this slippery slope, and just like there's no real clear answer to what do you find offensive, or who's to say what you think's offensive is what I think's offensive. Then you throw this out to some arbitrator who's going to say, well, yes, we're going to remove that content, censor that content, tone that content down. And oftentimes this person is someone, or this group of people are unelected and unaccountable to anyone. And so you seceded authority to these people, and there's just no end to it. I mean, you sort of let the snowball roll down the hill, and it's just going to get bigger and bigger until it just swallows up everything. And so who's going to be the person that ultimately says, okay, well, we've censored enough, or this is good enough, or we've whitewashed this topic or this idea enough. Now we're going to move on to something else. It never stops. It never stops that way. And so I think that's another aspect of that we have to think about too.
How long does it take for you to write a book?
About a year and a half, sometimes 2 years. It took me about 2 years to write Double Crossed. I started working on it right after the pandemic ended in 21, late 21, early 20, or late 20, early 2021. So it took me about 2 years because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of in a series with Ronan where we're kind of like midway through his sort of 6-book story or his 6-book arc. And so I had to set some things up for the kind of how the next 3 books are going to go in his story. And so writing that story about where cryptocurrency is a huge factor required me to learn a lot about cryptocurrency, what it is, how it works, how criminals are using it to sort of skirt around law enforcement, which was fascinating, but really sometimes dense and complex reading. And fortunately, I have some friends at Ole Miss and some friends elsewhere who are very good economists and very good mathematicians, and they filled me in on a lot of how all this works. But I wanted to understand it, but I also wanted to put that into the story in such a way that a casual reader who knows nothing about all of that can follow along and not get confused.
Do you have to isolate yourself, drink a lot of coffee, smoke a lot of weed to actually get motivated and get your creative juices flowing, or what's that process like?
Well, I'm a solitary writer. I've never been one of those people that can go to Starbucks or Panera Bread and just pop open the laptop, sit down for 30 minutes and just hammer out something. I get too distracted, by the smells and people talking and eating and drinking and all of that. And I just can't focus. I can go and read in those places pretty well, but writing is different. I have to be kind of by myself in a quiet room. I like white noise. I'll usually have something on as white noise in the background, but I write best by myself. How I've done it, the only way I've really been able to do it in terms of staying on top of it is to just schedule time to write every day. Just like I schedule time to exercise, just like I schedule time to, teach my classes or have office hours or grade papers or whatever it is that I'm doing, time for meetings, time for social events. I just block off on my calendar writing time. And I'm very protective of that writing time. And you really have to have a 4-alarm emergency to pull me out of that writing time, because that's very sacred and important time. And if you give up that time, or people know that you're willing to give up that time for different reasons, you'll lose that time and never get it back. So I'm, on my Outlook calendar, the writing time is in red, which means like DEFCON 1, don't you dare schedule anything, ask me to do anything. Like I said, unless it's a 4-alarm fire, or, a 4-alarm emergency or a DEFCON 1 situation, the roof's on fire or something like that. And even then I may not give up writing time. But that's the only way I've been able to do it, Buck, because I found that if you wait for the inspiration to come, there's always going to be something else to do. There's always going to be laundry to do. There's always going to be, other things, grass to cut, cars to walk. I mean, there's always going to be something pulling on your time. And the next thing you know, that 2 hours you scheduled to write is gone just like that. And you may not get it back for several days. So for me, just scheduling time during the week to do it is the best way that I'm able to kind of schedule it, but also make progress on whatever it is that I'm working on.
Is it more complicated being out and gay in Mississippi than it is being out and gay in West Virginia, in your opinion?
It's similar. I mean, I think, I'm fortunate in Oxford that Oxford's a pretty progressive community because of the university and because of the people that live here. Their attitudes about it are a little different. Now, if you go to rural Mississippi, you go down to the Delta, you get down to some other areas of Mississippi, I think the view would be different. I've never felt threatened. I've never had anyone threaten me. I've never felt unsafe or anything like that. But there's just a vibe and an attitude that you would feel in certain places. Just like in West Virginia, I think Huntington's is an example of a city that's very accepting of the LGBTQ community. I don't know if you saw this on social media, but they painted the rainbow color patterns on a crosswalk in the middle of one of the streets downtown just a few days ago before we taped our interview. So I think there's a very supportive community there. I don't know if you go to Beckley, West Virginia, that you'd find that same support. I don't know if you went to, let's say Buchanan, West Virginia, in the northern part of the state, you'd find the same attitude. I think it's kind of like Mississippi. I think your larger cities, Huntington, Charleston, Parkersburg certainly is a very kind of pro LGBTQ community. Morgantown, obviously, because the university's there, WVU's there, and Huntington has Marshall, obviously, too, helps with that. But I think that's probably pretty true, honestly, of a lot of states that I know, and a lot of friends that I have that live in other states kind of say the same things. There's certain places, yes, it's more accepted than other places, but certainly as a whole, much different now, much more accepted now than when I was in high school or college, 25 years ago. I mean, to think about the progress that has been made and how things are so different in a positive way just in that short amount of time is really amazing, and it's encouraging and uplifting to me.
So I have this last little thing called 5 questions.
Okay.
You ready?
Yes, I'm ready to go.
Judy Blume or Beverly Clearly?
Judy Blume.
L. Frank Baum or Roald Dahl?
Oh, Roald Dahl. Yes. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach. 2 of my all-time favorite books that I've ever read at any age on any subject. Roald Dahl always.
David Baldacci or Lee Child?
David Baldacci.
That's how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
My Mother's Keeper by B.D. Hyman or Mommy Dearest by Christina Crawford?
Ooh, I'm going to say Mommy Dearest only because the movie was so different from the book. Let me put it this way. There are 2 books that I think, we always talk about this all the time as readers and writers, that the books are always better than the movies. I think there's 2 movies where the movie was better than the book. I think Jaws is one of those. Peter Benchley's book is terrible, and the movie Jaws that Spielberg did was so much better. And I think the movie Mommy Dearest with Joan Crawford was so much better and so much more interesting than the book that her daughter wrote.
Amen.
So in those instances, I'm gonna pick that one. just because I think the movie is what people think really happened, but it's so much more interesting than the book and so much better than the book, just like the movie Jaws was so much better than Peter Benchley's book. So that's the one I'm going with. And I know that's not a short answer, but I felt like I had to give some context behind that.
The Bible or The Wonderful Wizard of Oz?
Oh, the Bible. The Bible. I mean, stuff that goes on in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, blows away anything that happened in the Wizard of Oz. I mean, from the burning bush to Noah's Ark to Cain and Abel to Sodom and Gomorrah to David and Bathsheba. I mean, you just go on and on and on. Yeah, Wizard of Oz, but you don't carry a torch to what happened in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament.
Reading truly is fundamental. If you are in grad school like me, it is also a real pain in the ass. My first semester, I read over 5,000 pages of text. My head nearly exploded. But there truly is nothing better than immersing yourself in a great book. I want to thank my special guest, Eliot Parker, for discussing his literary career and giving listeners insight into how he goes about writing a book. You can find out more about the author and buy his books at www.eliotparker.com. For Mothman and the Bible Belt podcast outlet updates, guest bios, episode breakdowns, and links to social media, visit www.mothmanandthebiblebelt.com. Thanks for listening.